Hey everybody, this is Valerie. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. So grateful to be back here with you again. And today I have Nathan with me. How are you today, Nathan?
I am good. It's good to be back.
Good. We are here today, as promised, to break down with you, present some details and do some analysis of the LDS Faith Crisis. Sorry, let me say that again. The LDS Personal Faith Crisis Report that was put together by a group of scholars about 10 years ago. And Nathan and I really wanted to break this down for you. This was news to us, as I have been talking to many of you through my Instagram page, Latter-day Struggles Podcast. There are a few of you who have been familiar with this. Many of you are just as new to this as I am. It has not been widely published or publicized. And so we just thought this would be really, really pertinent to our joint struggles and the work that we are doing here together, those of you who are here with us on the podcast today. Now, if you have not already done so, I would invite you to go back one episode because I did a fairly detailed overview of what exactly this personal faith crisis report is. No need to do it. It's not mandatory, but it will give you a pretty good overview of what we're going to dig into today. So today is part 2 of a 5-part series. And we are going to run through quite a lot of background today. And then we're also going to start jumping into the demographics of the survey and give you a lot of details. In the next session, I guess that's true. I am a therapist, so I speak in terms of session. Mm-hmm. Next episode, we're going to talk a lot about the breakdown of what these scholars found a typical faith crisis looks and feels like. Okay, you guys, so Nathan and I are going to go back and forth and run you through the ins and outs of this LDS Faith Crisis Survey. I'm going to start by talking you through the objectives. Now, some of this we're going to paraphrase, some of this we're going to read, and then we're going to do a fair amount of analyzing and just talking between ourselves about what we're making of what we have learned and are learning with you. Okay, so I'm going to open up by reading what these scholars wrote as far as what their objectives were. Okay, so here we go. The project objectives. The research team's objective is to present data on LDS personal faith crisis that can assist church leaders in, number 1, better understanding faith crisis catalysts and processes. Number 2, determining the best course of action for retaining these members currently in crisis, repairing damaged families, and mitigating the negative implications of those who are leaving or who have already left the church. And number 3, considering how best to prevent faith crisis from negatively affecting current and future generations. And so these are the objectives, the top 3 objectives of why this team donated so much of their time and energy to the putting together of this faith crisis report. Okay, so Nathan, go ahead and why don't you take it over next?
Yeah, so the thing I like about what you just said is that one of their objectives is to figure out how to fix the problem, which for me has always been a big impetus in this podcast. It's not just identifying the problem, but deciding how to fix the problem. So the first step is to identify what is the problem, what we're calling a faith crisis. Okay, so they use a very specific definition, which they say is this. It is defined as a state of intense emotional or spiritual distress resulting from the discovery of church history facts that do not align with the traditional LDS narrative. This distress then results in members losing faith in some or all of the foundational truth claims of the church itself. And I would add, and they add later, that it's not also just exclusively church history, but also some of the present day social issues contribute to it. But the point is that it is a spiritual and emotional distress that comes from an awakening to some of the things that the church has hidden from us in various capacities.
So this group of researchers then talk about the reasons why they decided to give their time and their energy and their the resources that they had, and their main resources was, of course, time. To the study of faith crisis. They said this: with the church being such a sacred, integral part of our lives, openly discussing faith crisis can be a heartbreaking task. However, The candid and expeditious analysis of this challenge is essential for these reasons. So basically, you guys, I'm not quoting now, this is just back to my own voice, is they're basically saying, while there are reasons why people may be ambivalent or fearful of actually saying these things out loud, the cost of not talking about this is far greater than the cost of talking about it. And these are the reasons why. Okay, number one, there are 4 reasons that they give. Number one, our data shows a significant number of church leaders who have traditionally been stalwart, active, and highly committed are leaving the church or lapsing into long-term inactivity, resulting in a void of local leadership. Number 2 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. Back to the quote. When long-term members go inactive as a result of faith crisis, a large ripple effect is created within the families, wards, and stakes. This ripple effect that causes others to lose their faith not be detected for months or even years from the point of first exposure. Number 3 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. Not addressing a faith crisis issue will compound the challenges of future leaders and future generations of families. And finally, number 4 reason to focus on faith crisis is this. While it is not uncommon in our recent past for, quote, left-leaning individuals to struggle in their faith over doctrinal issues such as Blacks in the priesthood or issues of LGBTQ, our data suggests an increasing number of individuals and families from, quote, the middle are also losing faith and reducing or eliminating church activity as a result of faith crisis. Anything you want to add to that, Nathan?
No, I think it's a good point, is that a faith crisis is not just about the individual, but it's about the effect on the family, the community, the ward, the future generations of children who will not grow up in the church if the parents choose to leave. All of those things have to be looked at as the potential consequences.
I think something else that I really resonated with is that some of these things are very insidious and you don't necessarily know that they're happening at the ward level. Right?
Yeah.
Until many years have gone by. But if you start accumulating data, not only from wards, but from stakes and regions, and, you know, and then it just kind of trickles out. Once you really start accumulating large amounts of data, the problem becomes far more evident. And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about for a minute here, which is the fact that what these researchers are really trying to highlight to the brethren is that their measure of metrics regarding the health of the church has been a very, very poor measure. And they actually, having looked at all of this data and analyzed it, they suggest a different measure to use so that we can better really assess the state of the health of the church. And Nathan, you're going to talk about that, right?
Yeah. So I just wanted to add one thing too,
sure.
which is that one of the things they don't mention, but they talk about later in the report, is one of the effects of a faith crisis is this, we've talked about this on our podcast too, is the coupling of faith in God with faith in the church. And the report goes on to talk about this extensively, but there is a way to save your faith in deity, even with an acknowledgement that your faith in the institution may have weakened or crumbled in some cases.
Well, and I think that's part of the larger problem here, which is part of the theology that we live in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is a real tight coupling of God with church.
Yeah.
And so people, so when the church has successfully linked themselves so tightly with God, and then people run into faith and trust crises, their success is such that people actually lose faith not only in the church, but also in God, which in my opinion is the biggest tragedy of all.
Right. I totally agree. I think that is the biggest tragedy. So talking about the metrics of the church, the church has always taken a lot of pride in its exponential growth. In the 80s and 90s, they would proudly beam from the general conference stands in April, how many people had joined the church and what the total church membership was. And that seemed to be sort of their main metric. They also at times would use tithing dollars, but of course they never publicized that. But those are things that they would look at. And what the report points out is that there's 2 problems with that. Number one, using church membership, total church membership as a metric. Number one is that it doesn't, many people who leave the church don't resign from it. So in other words, they don't actually submit formal letters of resignation. They just walk away. The other problem with it is that there are a lot of people who do stay physically present within the boundaries of the church.
Even active, technically.
Yeah, I mean, they're coming to meetings, but emotionally and spiritually, they have completely disengaged. They can't be relied upon to become leaders, or they don't have their heart in it. And there's a different level of activity associated with it. And so it's not really a fair metric to just say, this is our total church membership, because it's not reflective of the true commitment.
Some of what we have studied and looked at shows that the actual number that is quoted is, well, let me say it this way. The real number of active, faithful Latter-day Saints is, and this is just somebody's estimate, so nothing official, but is about 1/4 of the numbers that are on the official records of the church. And that has to do, of course, with a variety of things. One of them, of course, is, well, Nathan and I both served in Spanish-speaking missions, and the attrition rate for our own experience is very high. People don't tend to stay active in the first year after they convert, at least in the mission where we served. And then you have a whole different problem, which is those multi-generational members who have chosen for reasons of, holding on to their own integrity to leave, which is a whole different thing. But both of those are examples of how the church as a body doesn't necessarily know the state of health if they're just looking at membership numbers, because those are not going to be reflected in either of those particular issues that I just brought up. Okay. Yeah. All right. So Nathan, now you're going to talk. Okay. So Nathan's going to talk a little bit about what these researchers came up with. So as you'll remember from my last week's episode, I talked a lot about the professional qualifications and credentials of the folks that came on here and did this work. And some of these people, what they did is they looked at the way that, well, some specific reasons why not only is our church struggling, but why big institutions and big organizations and big corporate structures tend to fail.
Right.
And it has to do with innovation. So why don't you go ahead and pick up on that one, babe?
Yeah. So they point out in the report, this brother Clayton Christensen, who's a member of the church and also a Harvard business professor, wrote a book one time about two different types of innovation, what he called sustainable innovation and disruptive innovation. Sustainable innovation is when a corporation or a large body tries really, really hard to just keep the status quo because in the past it's worked pretty well. Disruptive innovation is when an institution or a company recognizes that what they're doing is not going to work in the future, and they are willing to scrap their model and really take a deep look at themselves and do things differently. And they use some good examples of corporations. For instance, Kodak, he uses the example of the corporation Kodak, who absolutely hung to the idea that film cameras were going to still be the wave of the future, even as digital cameras came out. And of course, Kodak has now gone the way of the dodo. Another example that's not in this report, but I think is even more indicative, is Blockbuster. Blockbuster forever held on to VHS tapes when everybody was moving to DVD and Blu-rays, and they finally moved to DVD and Blu-rays as everybody was moving to streaming. And of course, Blockbuster is now gone. They refused to look at what was happening and adjust to the real world. And so this kind of sustainable innovation, which is like, let's take a model that's a little bit old and outdated, has worked in the past, and really force it and force fit it and make it still work. It doesn't work. And that's what the point of this report is. And that's the point of Brother Christensen's research, is that we have to be willing to scrap what we've been doing, even if it's been successful in the past, and look at what's happening around us and adjust to reality.
Okay, so I want to just expand that a little bit, Nathan, and not challenge you, but I have a challenging comment to make. Is even if it has been working well. So unlike Blockbuster and Kodak, I guess you could say that it has been successful. Let me double back a little bit. The way that the church is trying to hold on to sustainable innovation is to try to manage its history and doctrine, not bearing in mind that it is no longer possible to be a correlated system where they can control all of the flow of data.
Right.
So it's been successful previously only from the perspective of it's been successful in controlling its data, even if it has not been ethical.
Right. So, I mean, you're going to touch on this in a little
Yeah.
bit. We're going to touch on this in a little bit, but the internet is the thing that changed
Yes.
the sustainable model. Okay.
Precisely.
So, they use a good example here of a company that adjusted, which is Apple. I remember playing Apple computers as a kid, and they were horrible. Compaq, HP, some of these other computer companies had much better devices. And yet, Apple figured out that gaming devices were not really the wave of the future. Personal computers, phones, cell phones, watches. Apple totally adjusted its model. I don't even think you can buy an Apple gaming system anymore. But they were able to say, hey, here's what's going on, and we're going to adjust to it. Now, of course, they're the second largest company in the world. And so for the church, the internet has been the game changer.
The internet has pressured the integrity of the church in its former ways of controlling and managing its data.
Yep.
And so what they have struggled in keeping up with is that beginning in the mid 90s, they didn't realize, or they realized, slowly and surely, that they were no longer able to manage the data that was becoming prolific on the internet. And they needed to get honest with themselves and with us. And short of becoming honest with themselves, what they are,